Iranians laid on the table was a negotiating position. They thought that that they don't have enough skill in negotiating, which, by the way, is a skill you don't just like. You have to learn how to do it. Um, you have to go to school to do it, and you don't get it naturally. There's different language and so on. So he went in without any planning, without any goals, and of course, the first thing that happened was exactly what every war game said was going to happen. Iran took control over the Strait of Hormuz. And it increasingly looks as if they did not take military control of it. It doesn't look as if there are mines there. All they had to do really was threaten to put mines there, because you can't move a tanker without insurance. And an insurance company is not going to move a tanker if there's a chance that there's a mine in the water. Similarly, they don't have to run the drones. They can just threaten to run the drones, because nobody wants to insure a tanker that is full of oil and might get struck with explosives. So they shut down the Strait of Hormuz mostly. They have let some tankers through, including some of their own. But what this has done is it's strangled oil around the globe. And I've talked a lot about that and the different kinds of oil and why the U.S. Can't use its own oil and so on. But the important piece here, in terms of the argument that I'm building in this talk, is that the price of oil has skyrocketed. Brent crude, there's two ways to measure oil in the oil markets, and one of them is Brent crude. And anything over 100 is just like, it makes your teeth ache. And it was as high as $119 a barrel today. It came down a little bit by the end of the day. But what that means, first of all, is that the world markets in gasoline and in heating oil and in diesel and in the things that run manufacturing plants all just skyrocket. The average cost of gasoline in the United States has jumped, I believe it's more than 80 cents a gallon now since February 27th. You can watch that, by the way. The AAA keeps a running tally of that. I'm sorry, the automobile, what does AAA stand for?
For real, I have to sell
American Automobile Association. And there's a Gas Buddy does as well, and those are the two things that people watch. But this is like crazy for the world economy, but certainly for the United States economy. And
I don't know what hole you're in. You need to do that itself.
To Donald Trump himself. Because the whole point of a lot of the voters who sided with him in 2024 over Biden was they wanted prices to come down, because prices had skyrocketed after the pandemic lockdown because of the fact there was pent-up demand, because of the fact there were supply chain problems. All of a sudden, when you try and start the world up again after something like that, prices go through the roof. They did come down. I mean, by the time Biden left office, they were about where the Fed likes them to be, which is at about 2%. They were at about 2.5, 2.9. Under Trump, they've gone up every single month because he didn't really have any plan to make inflation come down. He just wanted to get elected. So he told everybody he was going to bring inflation down. Instead, what you have seen as of February, which was last month, the numbers came out Tuesday. And today's Wednesday. So they came out. Yeah, I guess that's right. They came out yesterday. I'm sorry, I've lost track of time. Today's Thursday. They came out Tuesday. What you saw with those is that inflation under Trump really jumped in February. And I don't remember off the top of my head the number. I think it was 3.4%. It might have been 3.7, but it was a lot. And that was before you had to start factoring in the price of gasoline and the price that it's going to take to get food to market and goods to market, because diesel is crazy expensive all of a sudden, and that's going to be priced into the products that people buy. So this war in Iran has caused a huge problem. I mean, I'm not going to go into all the issues with it, and I've talked about the dead, and it's just what do they call it? A dumpster fire inside every disaster you can think of. But if you're thinking about what's happening politically, that is a huge problem for the Trump administration, because they've got this war now and they don't have a way to solve it. So you saw Trump desperately trying to browbeat allies and partners into joining on the side of the United States. And they were like, excuse me? You've been crapping on us now for years and saying you didn't need us and so on and so forth. And now you want us to go put our people in harm's way for a war that you started without consulting anybody? Just a minute. I need to go rearrange my sock drawer, right? So today, a number of European countries and Japan put out a statement in which it was really interesting because they put out a statement in which they did not say we're going to help Donald Trump at all. But what they did do was they issued a statement that said Iran must stop blocking the Strait of Hormuz. And you think, okay, well, they're siding with the U.S. Not so much. What they said in the statement was the freedom of the seas is central to the United Nations, and the Iranians are stopping that, and they must cut it out. And that's different than saying we're going to work with Trump. That's saying we believe in the UN. We believe in countries working together. And one of the central pillars of the United Nations was the idea of freedom of the seas. And the reason for that is because if you have freedom of the seas, then goods can travel freely and prices stay down. And as prices stay down, you get the ability for food, for example, to travel around the country, for grain to go to Africa and to Asia. And that was a really interesting statement for them. And one of the things we're living with is this idea that we have the international order is changing, but it's not necessarily just falling apart the way Trump would like it to. You've also got countries reasserting global trade and things like freedom of the seas. But Trump, he doesn't know what he's doing, and now you've got the Department of Defense under Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth asking for $2 billion in supplemental funding for the Department of Defense. And today, when reporters asked why he needed that much money for a war that Trump keeps saying is over or going to be ending, and this is not a direct quote, but it's close to it, Hegseth said it takes a lot of money to kill bad guys, which is not what one would call a detailed budget. So the idea that the American people are going to say, oh yeah, we didn't really care about health care, and we didn't really care about education, and we didn't really care about all the stuff you're cutting. What we really do care about is tax cuts for billionaires and another $200 billion on top of the extraordinary amount that the Republicans under Donald Trump have poured into the Department of Defense. Yeah, that's going to be a really hard sell. The idea that Americans are going to want to do that is going to be a really hard sell. At the same time, we still have the Department of Homeland Security shut down, which means FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, TSA, Transportation Security Administration. Those are the people who check you in to make sure you're safe at the airport. The Coast Guard. Those parts of the Department of Homeland Security, the Republicans are refusing to fund because they understand that the Democrats won't fund Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and Border Patrol, giving them yet more money, because remember, they injected all that extra money into them last July. They won't do that until there's reforms. No masks. You got to stop doing these warrantless breaking into homes. You can't, you got to stop, doing the extra legal stuff you're doing and so on. So at the same time, TSA lines are out of control, and our Coast Guard is not getting paid, and FEMA's not getting paid, and our TSA agents aren't getting paid. In order to force through more money for the Department of Homeland Security, now you've actually got the Defense Secretary saying, oh, by the way, can you just cut me a check for $200 billion? And that's not going to be popular. So that's another way in which I think we're going to see some pushback. But you're seeing it in a lot of other places too. So, for example, the chair of the Fed, Lawrence Powell, Larry Powell, Lawrence, not Lawrence. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. It's been a very long day. come on, why can't I think of it? Can someone throw it? It's not. Anyway, he was supposed to step down as the chair of the Fed. Remember, this is the guy that Trump has gone after. Jerome, thank you, Jerome Powell. Why did I say Larry? It's not, I'm sorry, Jerome Powell. I know why. Lawrence Powell is one of the conspirators who conspired to assassinate Lincoln. So, of course, that's the place I first go. I'm sorry, Jerome Powell, who did not conspire to assassinate Lincoln. He has announced that rather than stepping down as chair, as his term comes up, I think at the end of May or the beginning of May, sometime in there, he says, I'm staying. I'm staying until we get a number of things settled in the Fed. So that news has changed, I think, because there is an increasing understanding that this administration is off the rails. But you're seeing a lot of other pushback as well. So one of the things that that jumped out to me the other day was on the 17th of March, which was St. Patrick's Day as well as Evacuation Day. There was an Irish leader in the White House, and Trump started his whole thing about how Europe's going to disappear unless you get rid of all your immigrants, that sort of great replacement theory, white nationalist crap he's getting from Stephen Miller that fits so well into his own worldview. The guy pushed back. He said, no, actually, we need more immigrants. We need more innovation. Europe's a great place. And to speak back to Trump in the White House is new. I mean, there are other people, I'm sure, who have stepped on his toes a little, but that was Trump's central piece. And you can sort of see, you can watch clips of this. He doesn't quite know what to do. And I'm going to get these a little bit out of order now from the way I had intended to say them, because it seems like a good place to transition to. Trump is mentally falling apart. You can see it. You can see the vagueness. You can see the fact he called Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, the president of the United States the other day. You can see it in these rants that you're seeing on social media. You can see it in sort of his really inappropriate behavior. You can see that he's not all there. So when this guy spoke up to him and sort of pushed back, he didn't argue. He just kind of sat back like, oh, this is new. So you're starting to see people push back, but not just this gentleman who was in the Oval Office. What was really surprising to me about yesterday and today is there were a number of hearings on Capitol Hill of Trump administration figures. And the Democrats were really aggressive in their questioning. Some of the Republicans were too. And I don't know if you remember, but I kept saying the minute that Trump starts to lose people around him, like Kristi Noem, it's going to weaken him. And with that weakening, you're going to see more pressure on him and on the people around him. And that was clear in spades yesterday. So let me give you a list of some of those things. First of all, Pam Bondi, Attorney General of the United States, who seems pretty clearly to be running a cover-up of the Epstein files. And I hope I remember to speak more about the Epstein files in a minute. The Committee on Oversight and Reform in the House of Representatives.
All right, homie, so we just saw the video.
Kentucky, the guy I keep referring to as dumber than Panic.
We just saw the Litton.
His committee, a number of Republicans on his committee, on the beginning of March, subpoenaed Pam Bondi to appear before the committee to talk about the release of the Epstein files. Because remember, she was supposed to release all of those Epstein files by December 19th, and they haven't released half of them. And they've got one BS excuse after another for why not. And finally, I think there were 5 Republicans, don't quote me on that, but there were a number of Republicans on the committee who said, okay, we're willing to subpoena her and put her under oath. Okay, we're going to put her under oath, which is, one of the things that has been a problem for bringing accountability is that the administration, it hasn't been under oath. Now, you could argue in a number, and certainly they're not under oath when they're in front of TV cameras, but you could argue that there are ways that you could still prosecute somebody for that, for sure. But if somebody has sworn an oath to tell the truth and they don't, that's a pretty fast ticket to perjury, right? So theoretically, she's supposed to appear on April 14th under oath to answer questions about the Epstein files. And yesterday, she went in front of the Oversight and Reform Committee as just a hearing. So she wasn't sworn in. And this was supposed to be the committee's opportunity to ask her questions. And the Democrats just sat there and said, are you going to testify under oath? Are you going to come back for your subpoena? And she wouldn't answer. She wouldn't answer. So finally, the Democrats walked out, especially after Comer referred to Summer Lee, who's a Democrat from Pennsylvania. She kept saying that, and he actually used the word that she was bitching. This is one of his colleagues. Can you imagine? So the Democrats walked out, and I wanted to quote for you and you can find this, by the way. Maxwell Frost is a young senator, House of Representative, a representative from Florida, crackerjack smart. I did an interview with him, a little bit ago about the Epstein files, which is really informative. I highly recommend it. But he came out into the cameras and he said, we asked Pam Bondi multiple times, are you going to come and speak with us under oath? She wouldn't say yes. And the reason that we want her under oath, and this he said, we want her under oath because we do not trust her. Why don't we trust her? Because she's a liar. I mean, that's pretty strong language that the Democrats are finally coming out in front of the cameras and saying. So now that's hanging out there. At the same time, you've got the report that I wrote about, I guess it was last night, that the Department of Justice appears also to be covering up a drug investigation, drug prostitution and money laundering investigation into Epstein and 14 accomplices. So all that Epstein stuff is out there too, and the Democrats are calling it out. But that's not it. I wanted to quote something else that honestly made me laugh out loud when I saw it. Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, was testing in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee. And Angus King from Maine, he's an independent from Maine, is, he's a smart guy too. And he's very thorough in the work he does. And he's really, really unhappy he's also on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And he's really unhappy, or at least he appears to be, about what's going on with the United States and everything. But he's really upset about Hegseth and the Geneva Conventions that Hegseth appears to be ignoring, and he's always trying to get him on the record. So, and I'm not going to quote this directly, but Senator King asked Tulsi Gabbard if Russia was sharing intelligence with Iran. And she says, well, I can't tell you that. I'd have to tell you that in a closed session. And King says, well, wait, it's publicly reported in the newspapers. And she said, well, I still can't talk to you about it. And he said, is it happening? It's in the newspapers. This is not secret. And she said, I'd have to tell you that in private, but I can tell you that, and this is almost a quote, what I can say is that according to the Department of War, any support Iran is receiving is not inhibiting operational effects. That is, I can't tell you they're giving that Russia's giving Iran information, but if they were, it's not stopping the efforts of the Department of War. And King goes, that's sort of the first cousin of yes, I guess. I just love that he was like, this is crap. Like, he's like, you basically are BSing me. And again, this is a senator who's known for, I mean, he has strong principles, but he basically just called her out on that. I'm not done yet. Also yesterday, in the Senate, I'm sorry, I am tired. The Senate, not Armed Services, Senate Intelligence. I don't remember which Senate committee it was. It might have been Intelligence. I don't think so. No. It was Homeland. I think it was the Homeland Security. But no, that's the other one. I'll get to that one. I don't remember. I'm sorry. But Ron Wyden called out Kash Patel, the director of the FBI, because
bad decision with this charger.
the FBI has been very clear until 2023 that it was not accessing location information about Americans. In order to get that kind of information, the government has to go to a judge and get a warrant to say, we need to know where Heather Richardson is because we think she's doing something nefarious, and the judge says okay and signs it. These are not terribly hard to get, but they're not that common either. Wyden asked Patel to commit to saying that the government was not buying Americans' location data from private companies. And Patel said that he does, in fact, access commercially available information about American citizens. That is, he is buying, the FBI is buying private information about its citizens on the market, rather than going through a judge, simply buying it and having it as if they were, a private organization, which is just a crazy violation of the Fourth Amendment, which protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. And Wyden called that out and said, we simply must have laws around this, because this is crazy that your government can buy this stuff from you. But then there was yet, more than one thing. No, I guess there was yet one other thing, and that's that yesterday in the committee in the Senate on Homeland Security, Mark Wayne Mullen from Oklahoma, the senator from Oklahoma, who Trump is trying to get through the nomination process in order to become the next Secretary of Homeland Security. The chair of that committee is Rand Paul, and from Kentucky. And Rand Paul and Mullen don't like each other. And there's this incredible scene where Mullen defended. There was this thing a while back where Paul got into a fight with his neighbor and there was an altercation and so on. And Mullen went in front of the TV cameras repeatedly to say that, this is a reasonable way to solve these issues. And Paul really took him to task for that. And Mullen responded, well, I was just saying that there are other ways to handle things, like the dueling is always an option. And he goes on, and Paul goes, dueling has been illegal for 170 years. Like, what are you talking about? And what he was really doing, and he continued to go on for the rest of the hearing, was saying, I don't have faith in any person who is this prone to violence and this, to put him over a department that is already in trouble for its violence. And it was kind of a calling out of the whole Trump thing, the idea that, as long as you were going to be out there and swagger and throw your fists, that you were somebody who should run things. And Paul pushed back on that, which was really interesting. He's a Republican, of course. He's not a Democrat. And Mullen did make it through the committee. Now he's going to go in front of the whole Senate. But he only got through the committee thanks to the vote of Fetterman, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, who voted in favor of him. The vote was 8-7. That was, I think, today. So there are all these different ways in which people are pushing back against what Trump is doing that may not seem like they're a big deal, because you sit there and think, what does it matter that King has said that? It matters because they're slowing stuff up, they're calling it out, and they're making Americans aware of what is going on. And that's really, really important, because the more that Americans understand what's going on, the more they don't like it, especially now with prices going up over the Iran war, especially with the many different ways in which we're increasingly concerned about our safety in this country, about the destruction of our international alliances and partnerships and so on. So what I see in this moment is this small group of people who's trying to consolidate power And they might. I mean, they're really, they're going after us. But increasingly, we are seeing allies in places of power who are pushing back against the Trump people and their extraordinary incompetence. And I didn't go into the corruption stuff and so on today, but I will remind you that we still have hanging out there not only this war, but also the Epstein files, the corruption, which is increasingly visible, and you get people like Senator John Ossoff calling that out more and more. And the attacks on our troops, which people like Jason Crow in Colorado goes after, and so on. You're starting to see more and more of people coalescing around a vision of opposition to this administration. And that, I think, is where the power is resting right now and where the momentum is and why it's so important to keep speaking up. Now, before I finish, I know I went on way long today. A lot of people have asked about Cuba, and I would say that just because I'm telling you the momentum is on the side of those who want to restore democracy and rethink America's position in the world, for example, does not mean that Trump is done. And one of his hallmarks is that when something goes badly for him, he lashes out in a really big way. So, for example, after the last No Kings movement, that was a Saturday. On that Monday, that was the Monday he started knocking down the east wing of the White House. Now, after the tariff thing that came out of the Supreme Court, which obviously has him furious, days after that, or maybe a week or so after that, I don't remember the timing on that, he goes after Iran. And I will point out that he is now talking about Cuba. He's strangled Cuba's energy sector. So Cuba's very unstable right now. And he's talking once again about getting rid of the leadership of Cuba, which seems sort of to be his way of taking other countries under his control, essentially, rather, as I say, like Putin did. So that we'll see what happens and when Democratic senators have introduced legislation to stop him from doing that without the permission of Congress. Of course, the Republicans are probably going to stop that, but Cuba is definitely a place to be looking right now. And I like I say, I don't know where it's going to go, but I would tell you that we're going to see this back and forth, lashing back and forth, and he is completely untethered. There is an expression from the old Navy called somebody being a loose cannon, and you might note it sort of as a rhetorical thing, but it literally, a loose cannon was a cannon, and if you looked at cannons on ships, they were often in midships for a number of reasons, but cannons are really, really heavy, and they would bolt the cannons to the decks, and then they would shoot the cannons off, but old cannons, and guns do the same thing, right? They would recoil. So when the cannon went off, the cannonball would go one direction, but the cannons would have this recoil, and there were chains that held them to the deck so that they would chain back. They would bump back, but then the chains would hold them in place. Well, in a worst case scenario, the chains break, and the cannon then becomes loose. It is a loose cannon. And when you have a loose cannon, you don't know where it's going to go. Cannons can be thousands of pounds, and it's ricocheting around either inside the ship, or it's smashing through the opposite side of the ship, or the mast, or any number of places it could be. So Trump is now our loose cannon in the ship of state. And who knows what he's going to do one minute to the next. What I will say is our pressure, especially on elected Republicans, to stop this now before he does any more damage is more important now than ever. So again, we're in a really rocky time, but I urge you to maybe not to worry too much about the minutia because it becomes so overwhelming, but to recognize that Trump is no longer running the show. Trump is not able to run the show. Lots of other people are running the show. He's making orders and doing crazy stuff. but there's an increasing coalition of people pressuring the government to return to some sort of accountability and normalcy. And our voices in that are going to be crucially important going forward. Hey folks, showing up now. Winston-Salem, North Carolina, New Ipswich, New Hampshire, Covington, Louisiana, Huntsville, Alabama, historic town, Huntsville. So is Atlanta, Georgia, and what can I say, Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Hey, Kristen, how are you? I owe you an email. Fayetteville, North Carolina, Luzerne, Switzerland, St. Paul, Minnesota, keeping the faith there. Mexico City, and now we have Facebook on board. Okay, there's a ton of stuff going on today, so I'm going to jump right into your questions and into what the world looks like right now. We are, in fact, living through, at least so far, a major realignment of the global order, and that's exhausting. I don't know about you, but I am simply exhausted, and I don't mean sleepy tired so much as you just can't look away. There's another thing happening every 2 seconds because of the reordering and what it means. And so I may or may not have time to talk about ICE today, although I will try and do that. But I want to emphasize right now what Trump is doing with regard to what was known as the rules-based international order. Okay, so let's start with the fact that Donald Trump, the President of the United States, is not okay. It's not a medical diagnosis. I am not a medical doctor, but anybody who is watching him can certainly see the kinds of behavior that we have seen in our own relatives, our own friends, when they are no longer cognitively functioning correctly. So that's an issue. And it's an issue. I don't mean to downplay that. That's a huge issue. This is a man who has the nuclear football, right? And he is incredibly erratic. People ask me what he's thinking, what he's doing. And my answer to that is, I don't know. And I don't think we have any reason to try and unpick that particular ball of yarn, because what we're really trying to figure out is how to operate with it and around it. So the reason I set that up like that is that over the weekend, Trump lashed out at a number of European leaders, saying that, starting with the leaders of Norway, saying that because they didn't give him the Nobel Peace Prize, he no longer felt he had to emphasize peace, and he wanted Greenland. And this is, the scientific word for it is bonkers for any number of reasons, starting from the fact that the Norwegian government does not award the Nobel Peace Prize. You can go right down through a whole bunch of different pieces to that. He also said he wanted to buy Greenland, which is, somebody said, where's that money coming from? And the other piece there, of course, is that Norway and Greenland and Denmark, which is the kingdom in which Greenland sits, those are not the same countries. So, this is just, it was just sort of, this weird jumble of threats, but it's a threat coming from not your grandfather in the comfy chair in the corner, but rather from the most powerful man in the world. So all of a sudden, he took that threat against Norway and then sent it to the ambassadors of a number of other countries. And this threat was such that most of the observers, and I have to say myself included, did not think it was real. I mean, it was that bonkers. But then, of course, it turned out to be real. And since then, he has really doubled down on his threats with what feels almost like a sort of angry glee that he's going to do this, he's going to disrupt the world order, no matter what anybody else wants. So what does that mean? Remember that after World War II, the leaders of the Allies, actually even before World War II from the American perspective, in 1941, a long time ago now, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Prime Minister of the U.K., Winston Churchill, got together to talk about what the world might look like after the conflagration they knew that was coming, because there had been 2 world wars in their lifetimes. And world wars, any war is horrific, but these are true world wars with nations devastated, millions of people killed. I mean, refugees, countries torn apart. I mean, it was exactly, what you've seen on all those reels, but worse, because you weren't actually seeing on many of the reels the huge devastation of the civilian life and what it means to rip that many people out of a society. So they got together to decide what they thought the world should look like. And they came up with something called the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter in 1941 is really basic. It said, listen, how are we going to figure out how to stop this expletive from happening again in the future? And what they thought was, well, first of all, we got to have some rules. We got to say that you can't invade your neighbors, that's just a no-go. Like, you can't decide that you're going to march into somebody else's country and take all the rubber or take the coal or whatever. You can't do that. And you can't just try and grab other countries. And someday when I have time, I will probably talk about what that looked like for the United States when we lived in that period in the 19th century. And literally, the State Department would be sitting there watching these conflagrations around the world and trying to decide which way we were going to jump based on who looked strongest, how, where did it look best to be. But they said, we're not going to do that. There's some rules that say you can't do that. And that if you have differences with each other, you've got to figure out a way to work them out. We'll have some rules for that too. Mind you, I'm paraphrasing. But then they said, one of the real issues here is we got to make sure that countries have a rising standard of living. And they have to have a rising standard of living because people who are hurting for food and shelter and so on are really good candidates for becoming the pawns, if you will, of angry dictators who say to them, hey, I can make your life better. All you got to do is go invade, that country. They're the ones who caused all your trouble. You go over there and we'll get all their goodies and you'll have more money. So they said, how are we going to do that? We're going to try and get rid of an old world that had walls around countries made up of tariffs. I'll explain tariffs in a second. And we will also make sure that we have freedom of the seas. That is, you can take your goods around the world without fear that other people are going to prey on them, like pirates. Which is, again, that's a rabbit hole I won't go into right now. But tariffs are essentially, they're not exactly the same. I always feel that I need to put that caveat there because if there's any economists listening to me, I know your heads will explode if you hear me say this. Tariffs, though, are essentially taxes that are implemented on goods coming into another country. And they're paid, obviously, by the consumers, the people in the country that's importing the goods, because what happens is a country says you can't bring in, for example, French wine without me doubling the price of it. And the French are going to be like, we're charging them whatever our wine is. You're the ones adding the money to it, and that gets paid inside the country. But the problem with that for world trade is that it created what were called, tariff walls or walls around countries, and that really stifles free trade. So, and that had been a huge issue in the Depression, and that had meant that there was economic stagnation in the 1930s, which exacerbated the Depression and which certainly gave a leg up to dictators like Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany. All right, so they come up with this idea, and they're going to be talking about this throughout the world. What can we do? And I want to emphasize that these are two guys, and there's more of them as well. And they have staffers and all that, but these are just people, right? Sometimes I think when we think about these large international systems, people have these fantasies that, Zeus came down with godlike qualities and created them. No, this is literally Winston Churchill in the bathtub, right? I mean, like literally, there's a bathtub scene as he's thinking about all this stuff. So after the war, they decide, the FDR, Churchill, and all of their many allies at that point say, how are we going to do this? And they decide immediately after the war, the Allies plus a few other countries, that they're going to create an organization that is going to enable them to put these things into practice. And this is where we get the United Nations. There's a mission that literally says, and you can read this online, it's very short, it's very readable, where it says, we don't want any more wars. This is terrible what just happened here. We got to find a way to stop this from happening. So here's what we all agreed to. Those of us who are in the United Nations agree that we're not going to invade each other, that we're going to not threaten each other, that we're going to, which is interesting because Trump's obviously threatening everybody, that we're going to have rules to work things out, and that we're going to work together to try and make sure that more wars don't happen. Well, it's a great idea, except with the real consolidation of the Soviet Union after the war. A lot of the countries in Europe were like, we're not real happy with the idea of just this sort of loosey-goosey, let's all be nice to each other. We need a defensive alliance. So they put together something called the Western Alliance, which people, at least in the United States, don't hear much about. But pretty quickly they realized that's not going to be enough. They need to have a transatlantic alliance. And they need to have that transatlantic alliance in part because although the World War was fought in the Pacific and in the Atlantic primarily, right? The real threat from the USSR is coming over the poles to North America. So they both into Europe and across the pole into North America. And they realized at that point that they need a transatlantic alliance. And people always forget that over the pole things, but that's obviously very important right now. That's why NORAD tracks Santa, because they wanted to demonstrate that the organization between Canada and the US would be able to track anything coming across the poles like Santa, except that's not what they were worried about. All right, so in 1949, they put together, all these groups of countries put together the North Atlantic, right, Treaty Organization, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. And NATO is a defensive organization. And crucially, in their charter, which again, you can find online, easy read, the 5th article of that says, if any one of us is attacked, all of us will come to the rescue. So what this does is it creates this enormous defensive alliance that really managed to make the world pretty secure since it went into effect in 1949, in part because nobody wanted to mess with NATO. The U.S. was the big dog in NATO, but NATO at this point has, top of my head, either 32 or 39 countries. It's very big and it's very powerful. And that has managed to protect that world economic order, the freedom of the seas, for example, and the attempt to have not entirely free trade, but to keep trade barriers low across the country, across the globe, and has enabled, as I said to somebody before, more than 1 billion people to be lifted out of poverty since World War II, primarily in India and Asia, and has stabilized the world economy. And the country that has benefited most from that is the United States of America, because we had these relationships around the world, both economic and security arrangements around the world. And of course, since then, they have expanded far beyond that into Asia, into around the world. All right, so that's the world that existed before Donald Trump got into office. Now, what he is trying to do is to destroy that world. Why? Like I say, I'm not going to pick apart that skein of yarn. But in order to do that, I mean, one of the reasons that certainly people like Vladimir Putin want to do that, he's the president of Russia, is because that global order says to him, no, you can't have Ukraine. And he really kind of needs Ukraine because his own economy is in terrible shape. And he wants to take the parts of Ukraine that have it's a really good industrial area, and has minerals and stuff as well. So he wants that land. And so long as other countries are there saying, no, you can't do that, he wants to break that system down. And he's wanted to do this for a long time. Well, as of this weekend, it appears that Donald Trump is actively trying to do the same. That is, he's threatened NATO for a long time over a number of things. But what he did this weekend, and in his insistence that he is going to buy or seize Greenland, what he is doing is he is directly threatening NATO. Remember that article about Article 5, that if one NATO ally is attacked, they all respond? Greenland is an autonomous island in the Kingdom of Denmark. So Greenland is part of Denmark. Denmark is one of the original signatories to NATO. So when Trump has done this, this is not simply, do we want Greenland or not? Greenland is by the polls. It has very valuable resources in it, doesn't have a lot of people, does belong and has since 1916 and before that, but 1916, the U.S. recognized Danish possession of Greenland, a relationship with Greenland. And the trick to what Trump keeps saying is they're not strong enough. I get so angry when people say such derogatory things, but he says all they have is 2 dog sleds and they only got one of them recently. He heard that from someone. I would lay money. But of course, what Greenland has is NATO. We have a base in Greenland. I mean, they were part of and are part of this NATO alliance. So that's just completely smoke and mirrors. And that whole idea that, the U.S. is paying to protect Greenland and nobody, we're not getting anything out of it. That too is crap, because what we have gotten out of the NATO alliance and out of the other alliances we've had since World War II is this stable world that also has a stable economy. All right, so I mean, again, all relative. So I can hear without even looking people saying that's not true. That's not it's never been that great. No, of course it hasn't been that great. That's just like the laws that we live under. Not everybody obeys them. It doesn't always go right, but it has been a framework that we've lived under since World War II. And again, I would argue, and I have argued elsewhere that I won't do today, that there have been a lot of cracks in that for the last 40 years in the United States. Maybe I'll get to that in a little bit. But that's where we were, and that's why what Trump is doing is so cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. That is, this alliance, this system that has kept the world stable for 80 freaking years is being torn apart by a dude who's pissed off that he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize because somewhere in his wildly tangled brain, he thinks he has solved 8 wars, which is just, again, Fruit Loops. I mean, that just simply hasn't happened. All right, so here's the questions that you asked about. First of all, what happened when he did this? Lots of people in the European Union did not think that this was real. And then they discovered it was. And they recognize and are openly saying the U.S. president is not okay. We have a real problem. He is not okay. And they have actually openly called for Republicans in Congress to step up and do something, because the Democrats do not have the votes. For as much as they're trying to slow things down, and they are slowing things down, they're suing over things. For all that they're doing that, they do not have the votes. I'm going to come back to that, to get rid of Trump. So the European Union leaders are saying, do something. You Republicans must do something. And remember, the votes in Congress are slim enough that it would take about four Republican senators to make something happen to stop what Trump is doing. And so far, they are not doing it. Maybe even fewer in the House of Representatives, because the margin there is even smaller. All right, so what the EU has started to do is this. And this actually matters. I gave you that big, long setup because all of this matters, not in the short term, although there too, but we are watching the reorder.
Okay, I'm not saying a little bit about the week, then I'm going to
right now.
Okay, then.
And I'm sort of gobsmacked by that. I think one never wants to live through earth-changing moments, but here we are. So what the EU has done, first of all, is you have to remember that the European Union is the biggest trading partner for the United States. It is our biggest investor, and it is our biggest financial ally. So for all that the news tends to be consumed by China or whatever, it's the European Union that is the team. They're Team USA, and we are Team EU, certainly financially. And that's always, they have more. They do stand more to gain more from that than the United States does right now, because we have been bigger, although we are growing at a much slower rate now than other countries, thanks in part to the tariffs that Trump has imposed. Less that they are so far hurting people's pocketbooks than that they are causing extraordinary instability in people knowing whether or not they should build new factories or start a new business, or the uncertainty factor in the American economy right now is making a really, really big difference. All right, so what they have done is, first of all, they're starting openly to talk about something you're going to see a lot in the news. It's called the anti-coercion
Yeah.
instrument, which is a really unsexy title. So they gave it a nickname called the bazooka, which is it's a gun, I know, but those of us who are a certain age can only think of chewing gum. You know who you are out there. Anyway, what the anti-coercion instrument is not just one thing. It's a series of regulations that enables the European Union to work together to fight against any economy or nation that is trying to coerce them, to coerce their economies. So what they could do is they could retaliate with regulations on imports or exports with regard to the United States. They can also regulate or even stop U.S. investment in the EU or going the other way. So what they could essentially do is divorce the United States financially. This is a huge move, and of course, a lot of countries don't want to do that. But that is now on the table. It's never been used before, but you're going to see that a lot in the news as people are talking about using the bazooka. I hate that name because all I can think of is, do you guys remember the little pink boxes? Anyway, so they can do that. But there are other things. While Europe is talking about that, there's a bunch of other things going on in the United States that I'm sorry, let me finish with that. So Trump today gave a press conference actually, let me step back. Last night, beginning just after midnight, he began to post on social media really bonkers stuff. And it was really interesting for me in sort of, remember what I do is I study politics and economics and culture and all that. I'm an Americanist, but I'm really well trained in political history. And when you study political history, you read documents and you look at things not, sort of you're looking for the story that document tells. You're looking for the information in it, but more than that, you're trying to see, what does this say to me? What is going on here? And so I took a long look at the postings that Trump put on social media last night, beginning at about midnight and then running through today to his press conference this afternoon. And they were interestingly focused. That is, he is hitting at the European Union now and explicitly at the UN and NATO in a really insulting way. He's posting images that are insulting. As in showing a map of the United States, a map of North America in which everything, including Greenland and Canada, have a U.S. flag on them, and Venezuela has a U.S. flag on it. There's all kinds of stuff like that. But then there's also some other stuff going on in those posts. One is real concern about the economy, about the way people, he insists the economy is fine, but at some level, whoever is managing that account must be aware that it is not, because that kept coming up. So too is the reiteration of his false insistence that he won the 2020 presidential election. I'm going to come back to that in a second. And then there is also the idea that ICE is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement is only grabbing the worst of the worst. Worst of worst. He didn't use the word the. Worst of worst in Minneapolis. And what this says to me is that this is a person, or at least an account. I remain unconvinced that he is 100% responsible for what appears on a social media account, but that is very concerned about the way that Americans are reacting to the economy. There's obviously real concern. Trump is underwater. That is, more people disapprove of than approve of him on every single piece of policy. So he's concerned about that. He's also concerned about the way Americans are reacting to news coming out of Minnesota and elsewhere about federal agents under ICE and the customs customs people. And the other federal agents who are operating under the Department of Homeland Security, because we are increasingly hearing that they are abusing detainees, who are dying in custody, among other things. This is only what we're hearing about, by the way. And they are also detaining and arresting sometimes U.S. citizens who don't have warrants. They're busting into people's homes and taking people out. And he clearly, they are becoming less and less popular, and he's somebody is very concerned about that. And here's the other piece that he is concerned about, or someone is concerned about, is the fact that Jack Smith is testifying on Thursday in public about his investigation into Trump's attempt to overturn the 2020 presidential election. The election stuff has come up again and again and again today. And then there's Greenland. All right, so Greenland, the taking of Greenland is crazy unpopular in the US. It's unpopular everywhere around the world, but Americans do not want this. They do not want Greenland. They don't want to go into Greenland. They don't want to send troops to Greenland. They want no freaking part of Greenland. So what I see there, what I saw in all those tweets, came out today in Trump's press conference, which happened mid-afternoon. He was significantly late to it. He went on for an hour and 4 minutes, and it was just not okay. I mean, he slurred his words, he rambled. He began by holding up a big binder that said accomplishments. And theoretically, he was going to talk about the accomplishments of the first year of his presidency, the anniversary of which is today. But then he promptly stopped doing that and started holding up what seemed to be something like a mugshot of individuals he claimed ICE had arrested in Minnesota. And it said underneath them, worst of worst, with this idea that he's like trying to fight back against that narrative. He attacked Jack Smith again, calling him sick. He accused Democrats of corruption. He attacked Joe Biden again. He just seemed to be wandering like a squirrel in an attic through all that material. And once again insisted that he must have Greenland. All right, so with that going on, there are, I think, some interesting things happening in the United States. That is, Trump's not okay. He is trying to tear apart the rules-based international order. And he's very concerned because he's underwater on every issue, even though he's insisting that he's not. So one of the things that is important to remember in this moment, I think, is that the federal agents operating under ICE and other agencies are trying to project the idea that they're in control. But it's really important to remember that the people they are trying to control are certainly the people of color, the immigrants and U.S. citizens that are people of color in the United States. But in order to do that, they are trying very, very hard to control the rest of Americans as well. And somebody asked me to compare ICE today to Hitler's troops and to the slave patrols, and I can't do much with Hitler's troops. Like I say, I'm an Americanist. But I will say about the slave patrols in the American South before the Civil War, they were they were very much, obviously, about controlling the slave population, but they were also about controlling the white population. And that's important to remember in this moment, that, and the same was true after the Civil War, especially in the moments immediately after the Civil War. A huge number of Black Americans were lynched by their white supremacist neighbors, but so were a lot of white Americans in the early years. The idea being to create terror against anybody who would stand against the regime. And you're seeing the same thing in Minnesota. And that's important to remember, because as they are trying to cow Americans, white American citizens, it's not working. And this is one of the things I think that terrifies Trump, is that it's just astonishing to me he started this in Minnesota. So I don't know if many of you have traveled much in Minnesota. I won't say I've traveled a ton in Minnesota, but I'm there not infrequently. There's a reason it's called Minnesota Nice. And they have a sense of community, a really deep sense of community and history. One of the reasons I go there so much is they have a very well-supported history museum that has people like me in to talk all the time, because they are so incredibly civic-minded. And they could fill a major lecture hall twice in one day to hear a lecture on something like the Homestead Strike, which I spoke on there once. These people care deeply about their communities. So to start in Minnesota, which I don't think they picked for that reason, I think they picked it because it has a large Somali population. But to start there and to try to impose their will on that particular community was an interesting choice. Maybe they didn't really believe in such a thing as community, but it's not working. Minnesotans are working together to reinforce community against, as I'd say, these badly outnumbered ICE agents in a country that has 340 million people. So that aspect of ICE, the attempt to cow all Americans, not simply people of color, but all Americans, to say, oh, you're right, I'm not going to stand against Donald Trump, seems anyway to be backfiring. And instead of that happening, what you're seeing, I think, with this combination of Trump's deterioration and that pushback is immediate ratcheting up. This attempt to really force Americans to knuckle under to the Trump administration. That is increasingly problematic now. And I think you can see it really being pushed by people like White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller. But I think it's especially problematic now as Donald Trump is so clearly mentally deteriorating. All right, so you asked me about the 25th Amendment, and other people have asked about impeachment. And let me tell you about those two things. First of all, the 25th Amendment is a complicated amendment. It was designed initially by Eisenhower. You see, if you read about it, that everyone claims it was designed after the assassination of Kennedy, but in fact, it was Eisenhower who decided we needed to have such a thing because two reasons. One, because he had been incapacitated by ill health during his presidency and knew there needed to be some formal method to make sure that the president was covered in case he could not fill his job. And also because in World War I, he had watched a commander who was not okay, making poor decisions that killed people. And he knew that man there should have been a mechanism for getting rid of that person. So anyway, the 25th Amendment is complicated, and it requires a number of the people in the cabinet, including the vice president, to say the president's not okay. And the problem with that, and one of the reasons people like me were so angry about the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate putting in place the people that they did into the cabinet, was not only that they were unqualified for the positions they now hold, but they know they are unqualified and that they hold them only by virtue of the fact that Donald Trump is in office. They're not going to 25th him. They're just not. Try and think that through. They should, but they're not going to. So that leaves the idea of impeachment. Now, the thing about impeachment is that it was designed by the framers of the Constitution to be nonpartisan. And certainly the things that Trump has done, Trump 1.0 as well as 2.0, have the things that he should have been impeached for were as long as your arm. And somebody asked, well, if he's got immunity because of the Donald J. Trump versus U.S. decision from July 2024, how can they impeach him? Remember, impeachment is not about crimes. It can be, but it can also be that you are simply not doing your job. So one of the examples I always use is you could elect me president and I could do nothing but sit in the White House watching video games, which probably wouldn't happen because I've never played a video game in my life, but I might just sit there reading history books. And in that case, I haven't broken any laws. You're allowed to sit in the White House and read history books, but I'm also not doing my job. So you could impeach me and say, you're not doing, we don't trust you. You're not doing your job. The world is falling apart. We need somebody else in that position. That's not a crime, but you could be impeached for it. In this case, the Supreme Court has said that Trump cannot be prosecuted for crimes committed as part of his regular duties as president, but he can be prosecuted not while he's in office. That's a subset over there. But after office, he could be prosecuted for things that are not part of his official duties. And that's what Jack Smith is going to be testifying about on Thursday. The things that he found that were not part of a president's official duties that Trump engaged in order to overturn the election of 2020. So he could be impeached. But the problem with that is the Republicans in the House of Representatives are not going to do that. They're just not. I suppose they could. I mean, the irony of this is that if you had those 8 Republicans who did this, they would go down in history as the saviors of the country. I mean, they would be right up there with, Eisenhower and Grant and Lincoln, and the fact they won't do it is an interesting psychological study, but it's also, I think, a problem with where our politics are. Because I say there's a hotline to fame and fortune right there, and they're not taking it. All right, so impeachment's not going to work, or maybe it could, but that's not the only way that Republicans could ease Trump out of the White House. And one of the ways to do that is what happened with Nixon. When it was clear that he had lost support, a number of Republican senators went to him and said, dude, we will impeach you and we will convict you. So, hie thee out of the White House. And he did. There are many ways that one could persuade Trump to leave the White House, I think. That's speculation, and it is, I'm just trying to give you a little bit of a sense that if you're sitting there waiting for somebody to invoke the 25th, as they should, I wouldn't hold my breath, and I wouldn't hold my breath for impeachment either, but I'm also not saying to you that you have to assume dude's going to be there until 2029, because first of all, his mental acuity is not going to make it that far. And that, again, not a medical diagnosis, but come on. And somebody asked me about that, said, why do I keep saying we're going to know everything by May? Because we cannot continue this way. He is deteriorating in front of our eyes. And, something's going to give. Either he's going to do something completely wackadoodle, or he's, not going to be able to complete his job or whatever. Now, there's another factor in that, and the reason I picked on May is because if you're a Republican and you want to be elected to anything in 2026 or 2028, you do not want to continue to back this guy. Even if you like everything he's doing, he is visibly falling apart in front of American voters. Now, again, you might say, well, a lot of my voters don't watch him. It's okay. More and more cartoons of him as a screaming baby, him in a leotard. I mean, because he's taking prizes from Simone Biles, for example. You don't want that. You want him off stage. And that is, I think, a piece to remember, that the more elected Republicans hear about how unhappy Americans are with Trump, the better the chances are that they will move him off stage in one way or another. And I hear all the time, well, J.D. Vance is just as bad. J.D. Vance, listen, you don't have to like him at all. J.D. Vance is not bonkers. I certainly have grave concerns about J.D. Vance, but I don't think J.D. Vance is going to accidentally incinerate the world. So that is part of what's going on here and worth thinking about. And I'm going to come back to that in a second, and about where we are in a second. But one of the places I want to go here is, and see, I feel like I've already gone on way too long, and this is so much is going on every freaking minute. But the United States, with Trump at its head, is really abdicating the role that it's held on the world stage for the last 80 years. And one of the things you're seeing with the European Union right now, and with the World Economic Forum at Davos and so on, is a lot of people who kind of are going along with the U.S. throwing its weight around for a long time are saying, we can't live like this. The U.S. is no longer a reliable partner. And that is making them cozy up to China. You've seen that with a number of countries recently, including Canada. And you've also seen people starting to walk out of U.S. financial instruments, for example. Starting to say, we want to make sure we're diversified enough that if you people really go off the deep end, you don't drag us with you. And that mattered today in Davos, because the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, gave a speech. And in that speech, he did something really interesting. He actually said, cut it out. All of you people who are sitting there, and he's speaking primarily to other leaders, not just political leaders, but business leaders and so on, that are hoping that the rules-based international order is going to come back, cut it out. It's not coming back. It's gone. And we have to stop hoping that the United States is going to become the partner that it once was, because it's not. And he also said, it hasn't been a very good partner for a while now, which is also true. And I'm sorry, that was my editorial comment. It is also true. And so he said, it's time for us to think of the future. And then he did something that I've been watching for now for at least a year. And that is, he outlined a new vision of foreign policy for the globe. And that's why I set this up so much at the beginning of this talk about what the world used to look like. Right now, there's a lot of people going, crap, what do we do next? And Putin and Xi and Trump all want to divide the world into thirds and so on. And what are we going to do? And Carney articulated a new vision, and it was a really interesting one because it was virtually identical, although a slightly different name, to the one that Biden, former President Joe Biden and former Secretary of State Antony Blinken were putting in place during the 4 years that they were in power in the United States. And what Carney called that was variable geometry. What Biden and Blinken called it was diplomatic variable geometry. And what that means is, first of all, I think it's a perfectly awful name, and I always thought of it as ad hoc committees or tables, basically. What that means is that what they have said is that instead of dividing the world between communism and democracies the way the world tried to do in the Cold War, which didn't fit very well, or trying to turn it into democracies and autocracies or whatever, what this plan suggests is that the world itself should use a model much like the European